Your fantasy playoffs are basically here. They're at least quickly approaching, maybe 1 or 2 more weeks. And I believe that I found the 5 best wide receivers for the fantasy playoffs that you need to win your league. These receivers have great roles, strong talent, but the big reason why you want them is their playoff schedules are insanely good. And it starts with Calvin Ridley. If you were able to weather the storm of the early season Calvin Ridley struggles and the Will Levis poor play that has now improved, well, congratulations, because I believe you have a league winner on your hands in Mr. Calvin Ridley. And this great Ridley usage continued in week 12, where he sees a 26% target share against the Houston Texans. He turns that into another strong performance. He doesn't break 100 yards, but he gets damn close. 5 catches, 93 yards. He has another massive reception in this game of over 50 yards. It seems like every single week we're seeing an explosive play from Will Levis. That's what he's known for, his big arm. He's going to be reckless, but he'll take some shots like Jameis Winston, and he's taking them to Calvin Ridley. Now, Ridley right here, if you look at these weeks on Fantasy Life, these weeks from week 8 to week 12, I specifically point this out because this is when DeAndre Hopkins was traded away from the Tennessee Titans. And since then, it's been a completely different player in Calvin Ridley. They're using him a little bit different, but of course as well, there's no more DeAndre Hopkins to take away target competition. 38% target share the first week that Mr. Hopkins was gone. And then just look down that column, 32%, 39%. By the way, anything like 25% or above is elite. 20%. Okay, his worst performance is 21%, which is still solid. 26% on that span, he's seeing a 32% target share. During this time, since week 8, Calvin Ridley ranks top 5 amongst all wide receivers, not just, rookies and a couple of, all wide receivers. Calvin Ridley ranks top 5 in usage. And a big reason for that is there's just no more target competition. I like Tyler Boyd for what Tyler Boyd is, a guy out of the slot who can win. We saw him have a 5 or 6 catch game this past week. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, a lot of people will point to and be like, oh, this guy's super good. Look, in general, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine is probably one of the worst separators in the NFL. I do believe he's playing better this year, hence why he's scoring so many touchdowns. And just how many touchdowns, you might ask? Well, for a player who literally did not record a stat, a target or a reception in the first month of the season, some of that due to injury, some of it due to DeAndre Hopkins there, from week 6 on, look at this right here. He scores in week 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, then he doesn't score and he comes back with multiple touchdowns. This dude has literally scored in 6 out of his last 7 games. So me saying, he's not a really good separator, of course, that's a little bit disrespectful. I'm talking relative to most NFL players. This is not an efficient wide receiver. He's just on a very hot touchdown streak. But if you were to actually pull up his volume this season, 2.5 targets per game, of course that's not threatening Calvin Ridley. We all know this. You know this. Calvin Ridley has no competition. And the reason why this is even more exciting is because Will Levis is finally playing good. They ended up benching him. It was a little bit of an injury, a little bit of a benching. They put in Mason Rudolph. Obviously, Mason Rudolph wasn't the answer. Obviously, you're not building your future on Mason Rudolph. Might as well let Will Levis, the kid, go out there and play and see what happens rest of season. Now, I don't think Will Levis will ever be the quarterback for the Tennessee Titans in the future, although it is a bad draft class, so we'll see what free agency holds. But for right now, he's playing much better. This past week, he completes 75% of his passes, nearly 300 total yards and multiple touchdowns. He throws a pick 6, right? He throws a pick 6. So in real life, there's still this Will Levis, crazy reckless. He's going to make mistakes out there, but for fantasy, he's sustaining production for his pass catchers. So much so that this past week, not only Ridley, but also Boyd, also Nick Westbrook, heck, we could even go down to Chigakonku, who only had 1 target, but he turned it into a big touchdown. 4 different Titans pass catchers this past week had at least 11 fantasy points each. 11 fantasy points doesn't sound like a lot, but when 4 different guys are doing it, your quarterback is obviously doing something right. And that's been the case over the past month of the season. Will Levis, believe it or not, don't look now, ranks 4th amongst all quarterbacks the past month in quarterback efficiency, his yards per attempt. I mean, this is a very strong metric overall. Obviously, Derek Carr sneaks into here, but the other quarterbacks in this area, Justin Herbert, Jalen Hurts, Kyler Murray, Jared Goff for sure, Jordan Love as well, playing very well since coming back from his bye week. All these guys are, it's a good indicator of the quality of play that they're doing, just the quality of talent those guys have. Will Levis, at least for the past month, is up there with those guys. Now, the big reason why Calvin Ridley makes this list, if he was going to be facing the Chiefs and the Denver Broncos every week, he wouldn't, but he's going to be facing some good defenses. Good in terms of good matchups for fantasy. Let's take a look at it right here. Okay, these next 2 weeks, these are not the fantasy playoffs, but they're still strong matchups against the Commanders and Jaguars. The Jaguars who allow the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, right up there with the Ravens. I believe they surpassed them after this past week. Let's scroll down a little bit more here. This is where it gets interesting. The Bengals, ranked 26th in coverage, allow a top 10 rate of touchdown passes and top 10 in yards, passing yards per game. So everything there in the first game at home against the Bengals looks really good. Next up, it probably gets even better against the Colts, who allow the 6th most passing yards per game, the 8th most receptions against wide receivers, and then, week 17. If you are lucky enough, or skilled enough, we should say, to make your fantasy championship, or heck, maybe you're watching this and you're just trying to avoid the toilet bowl, Calvin Ridley in week 17 against the Jacksonville Jaguars, let me tell you something. The Jaguars allow the most receiving yards per game and the 2nd most receiving touchdowns, and the last time we saw the Jaguars before their bye week, they gave up 412 passing yards to Jared Goff and 4 touchdowns. So Ridley is a league winner that you must have, and so is Mr. Jakobi Meyers, who I just want to touch on the production since he came out of his bye week. He had a new play caller, of course. They fired a bunch of people here in this organization the past couple of weeks. Jakobi Meyers in week 11 out of the bye. This was a guy who was dominating before this without Davante Adams, only a 12% target share. That's a little bit concerning. This led to him going out there and having just 4 catches for 28 yards. He did have a 20-yard rush, which almost salvaged his day, 8.8 fantasy points. Okay, so now you're seeing this new play caller, and I'm immediately going, this is a concern. Like, your best wide receiver, obviously Brock Bowers, a tight end, your best wide receiver, Jakobi Meyers, why is he not involved? Well, the new play caller must have heard me, right? Because he comes out the next week, 98% of the routes, a elite 32% target share, and this leads to a monster day. 10 catches, 15 targets, and a tough matchup against Denver. Doesn't matter for Jakobi Meyers, who operated and dominated out of the slot for plenty of this game. He goes for 121 yards, 25 fantasy points, and that's more like it for Jakobi Meyers, because since Davante Adams left this team, whether it was for injury or then being traded away all the way back in week 4, since then, Jakobi Meyers, similar to Calvin Ridley without DeAndre Hopkins, is seeing elite target volume. Look at this, a 42% target share, 26, 24, 37. Oh, that bad week after the bye when he only sees 14% was only his worst. It was his worst, an outlier to me, because then 32%. During this time, Jakobi Meyers, if we pull up Ryan Heath, who is a very good Twitter follow, you can see right here, during this time, a 25.5% target share for Jakobi Meyers. That ranks top 12 amongst wide receivers. 15 fantasy points per game. That ranks top 12 amongst wide receivers. So you have Jakobi Meyers the past 2 months of the season, a top 12 wide receiver despite playing with multiple different quarterbacks, different overall offensive schemes out there because of the offensive coordinator change. And oh, by the way, he's about to get another quarterback change back to Aiden O'Connell, because you're getting Aiden O'Connell returning from injury and Gardner Minshew now out for the season with injury. Now, we did see earlier this season, we saw Jakobi Meyers play with Aiden O'Connell in just 1 game, and he had 9 targets and 13.2 fantasy points. But we had a bigger sample last year. And in 11 games with Aiden O'Connell last year, Jakobi averaged 12.2 fantasy points per game on 6 targets per game. And that's not bad considering that Davante Adams was also on the team and performing pretty well during this time last year. So I'm a believer in Jakobi Meyers. I've been trying to trade for him. Was able to in a couple of leagues. I've been trying to trade for this guy for like a month to 6 weeks. I think he's so underrated, and I think his fantasy postseason schedule, tough matchup against the Chiefs, but he just had a tough matchup against the Broncos and it didn't matter. Then an elite matchup against the Bucs, as good as it gets, a top 5 matchup in fantasy. And this is where things get interesting, the fantasy postseason. It starts right here against the Falcons, who have arguably the worst pass rush in the league. That means there's going to be more time for a poor quarterback to find Jakobi Meyers. And the last time we saw the Falcons, they were giving up over 300 passing yards and 4 touchdowns to Bo Nix. Then he gets the Jaguars, who we just kind of went all off about how they probably are, if not them, right up there with the Ravens, the worst overall defense and best matchup for fantasy wide receivers. And then the Saints. If you're lucky enough to make it to your fantasy championship in week 17, you get a bottom 10 Saints defense that allows the 5th most receiving yards per game. Great schedule for Jakobi. Hey, before we keep going in this video, I got to tell you about something I'm pretty excited about. And that's the NFL 2K Playmakers game. Now, let me explain. If you're a fan of football or just a fan of collecting sports-related stuff like me, you're probably going to love this. Because this NFL 2K Playmakers game is pretty similar to fantasy football in terms of it allows you to take control of their game as a coach or a manager. But it gets better. Because you could build your dream team, the exact team that you want, with hundreds of player cards. I'm talking real NFL players. Now, not only will you be able to assemble your squad like a fantasy manager, but you'll also be able to make the calls during the game to actually help your team win. It's like being on the field without actually having to be on the field. Now, the NFL 2K Playmakers has tons of modes you can play. They have the Seasons mode, the Red Zone Drive mode, and my personal favorite is the Game Changers mode. And the reason why that's my personal favorite game mode is because it's powered by real NFL stats. And like we do on this channel all the time, we break down stats, and now that analysis can help you with this Playmakers game. And if you're actually good at these game modes, you could even win some sweet in-game rewards to boost your squads even more. So far, to me, this game is so much fun. And trust me, we love watching our fantasy lineups on Sunday. This is just another add-on, another bonus, another thing we get to monitor while the games are on Sunday. So if you want even more things to be sweating on Sundays, go to the App Store or Google Play Store now and download NFL 2K Playmakers. And here's an additional gift for you beautiful people. You can get even more exclusive rewards when you use the code TOUCHDOWNZ. With this code, you'll get your shot at stars like Deebo Samuel, Lamar Jackson, Sauce Gardner, and so many more. So enter the code TOUCHDOWNZ in the NFL 2K Playmakers app and unlock these exclusive rewards before it's too late. So a big thanks for the NFL 2K Playmakers for sponsoring this here video. Now let's get back into it. All right, now the next man up is first round rookie Marvin Harrison Jr., and he just returned from his bye week in week 12. And as a rookie, I was hoping to see some changes to the offense. I was hoping to see more usage for Marvin Harrison, and for the most part, we didn't get it. Like, you look at the box score here, and it's just 6 total points for the Arizona Cardinals coming out of their bye is extremely depressing to see, but then you kind of break some things down. And if you watch Kyler Murray in this game, it wasn't terrible. Like, he was actually decent, I would say. I wouldn't say he was elite. He still throws a pick here, but in terms of completion percentages, there wasn't a ton of challenging throws, but he still gets going. 285 yards, 7.7 yards per attempt is good. Again, if you watch the film, you'll get way more context to this, but all of it goes to Mr. Trey McBride. I mean, legitimately half of the production in this game, whether it's receptions, whether it's targets with 15, 133 receiving yards, everything goes to Trey McBride, so there's just nothing left for the receivers. Michael Wilson, 2 catches. Marvin Harrison, 3. Heck, even 5 check down passes to James Conner in this one. Between the running backs and the tight ends in this game, you're seeing 18 receptions for nearly 200 total yards. Of course, the wide receivers aren't going to get theirs at that point. And that's exactly what happened for Marvin Harrison in this game. Despite continuing to go out there and run almost every single route, 95%, he sees just a 15% target share. And this has been the concern for Marvin Harrison all season. It's just the lack of volume that you're getting, and it leads to these performances, right? Even in a spot where Kyler Murray looks like he's playing well, he's focusing in on his tight end and running back in the check down game, and you get just 3 catches, 47 yards for 6 targets. This is not what you wanted. You did not want, in a potential shootout against the Seahawks, a division rival, the Seahawks, your second round pick in fantasy, Marvin Harrison, barely getting to 7 points. And now on the season, he's averaging 6 targets per game, and now on the season, he only has a 22% target share. Again, a second round pick, you don't want him ranking 37th in the way that he's getting used in his offense target-wise. That is a concern. He's clearly not the number 1 option in this offense. That would be Mr. Trey McBride, hence his 15 targets this past week. You look at the consistency in Marvin Harrison's game, it's not there at all. If we scroll over to his fantasy points per game, according to Player Profiler, early on in the season, it was like, oh, he had the stinker week 1, then he started popping off, wide receiver 1 overall, a bunch of 15-plus point days, and since then, it's been extremely hard to come by. You're getting 5-point days. He started to get going a little bit before the bye with a 23-point game. He scored a touchdown. A 16-point game, he scored a touchdown. So that would be the saving grace. He's trending in the right direction, but why only 3 receptions? Why only 4 targets the first game out of the bye? The reason is Kyler isn't looking his way because Marvin Harrison is struggling to separate still. We have seen them, though, increase the amount of deep usage they're giving him. He now ranks top 10 in deep targets, which is good, but we kind of need a balance here. We just can't have Marvin Harrison running go routes. There's a reason why he's a great route runner. We want some in-breaking routes along with those deep posts, right? Just not some go routes that are low percentage to be completed with no yards after the catch ability. But the saving grace for Marvin Harrison is that he is still talented. We now have a dozen or so games of him playing in the NFL this year, and there is legit talent to him. Does he have some flaws? Yes. Like any rookie, and most rookies do, he has some flaws, but his rest of season schedule should help with those. If you've been able to stick out the Marvin Harrison season, his rookie year right now, whether you're in Dynasty or a season-long league, everything should be going your way pretty soon. He gets another matchup against the Seahawks, which is tough. The Vikings actually allow the 5th most passing yards per game this year, but let's scroll down right here. The fantasy postseason is where things get very nice for him. It starts against the Patriots, who have a bottom 10 secondary this year. They just allowed Tua Tagovailoa to have 317 passing yards and 4 touchdowns. They just allowed Jalen Waddle to have by far his best game in nearly a year to a year and a half with 144 receiving yards. Then you get a matchup against the Panthers, one of the best matchups you can find. A bottom 10 secondary, allow the 3rd most receiving yards per game, and the Panthers just allowed Patrick Mahomes, who struggled all season, that passing game has struggled all season, to complete 73% of his passes, nearly 320 total yards, and 4 touchdowns. Check that. 3 touchdowns, but it might as well have been 4. Jesus. The dude, I was facing him in multiple fantasy leagues. The dude, every time he dropped back, I was like, yeah, probably 10 to 20 yard completion, and that was about the case. And then if you make your fantasy championship game, you get the Rams on the road, sure, but the Rams this year rank 28th in coverage according to PFF. They allow the 4th most receiving yards per game, and A.J. Brown is coming off of a 109-yard performance where he scores a touchdown against them. That is a great matchup. I think in general, these 3 weeks will probably be the weeks where we see the most maturity, the most development out of this offense, and the connection between Kyler and Marvin Harrison. Hold out hope. He's a league winner. And I probably don't have to tell you this at this point, especially if you're a Courtland Sutton fantasy manager in multiple leagues or you drafted him like I did. Courtland Sutton is, of course, a league winner. And if I told you multiple months ago that Courtland Sutton would be a top 5 fantasy wide receiver the next 7 to 8 weeks of the season, if I told you that all the way back in week 1 and 2 when this Denver offense and Bo Nix looked atrocious, you would laugh at me. But right now, Courtland Sutton, the past 2 months, is a top 5 fantasy receiver. And specifically, over the past 5 games, since he laid that goose egg on Thursday Night Football and Sean Payton said, sorry, Sutton, we'll get you going the next game. That's a legit quote. Here is indeed what you have gotten. 15 plus points in every game, 9.6 targets per game, and 93 yards per game. And during that stretch these past 5 weeks, he has the 2nd most wide receiver fantasy points behind only Jamar Chase. Oh, you don't believe me on that? Well, I ended up pulling this up on Fantasy Pros just to show you. He's ahead of Amon-Ra. He's ahead of Cooper Kupp. He's ahead of CeeDee Lamb. He's ahead of all these guys. JSN, who had a 40-plus point week in there. Only Jamar Chase, who had a 50-plus point week in there, is ahead of Courtland Sutton since week 8 in total fantasy points at the wide receiver position. You're getting all the key stats out of Courtland Sutton. The volume is there. He's top 5 in overall targets. A 25% target share is borderline, if not elite. I love to talk about the fantasy cheat codes. Those are your deep targets and your red zone targets. These are the targets that, in general, the fantasy cheat code targets lead to higher days for you, touchdown touchdowns and 20+ yard receptions, explosive plays, but also a stable floor if you're seeing enough of them. And that's what Courtland Sutton is seeing. He's 6th in deep targets, 4th in red zone targets. We saw multiple touchdown passes for him in receptions this past week. He is top 6 in both metrics. When you combine these, he has 33 cheat code targets. That ranks 2nd in the NFL. These are numbers that only some of the best receivers in the league put up. A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf on a year in and year out basis. Sutton finally seems to be healthy and in an offense that is maximizing his skills. And in terms of consistency, the game logs here from Player Profiler, again, those first 2 weeks, you were like, oof, this offense is terrible. I spent a 10th round pick on Sutton, 11th round pick. That's fine. Maybe I'll drop him, put him on my bench. Since then, it's just been all consistent. Like 15 and 14 point days are the worst you're going to get. This is where he had that goose egg on Thursday Night Football in a massive high scoring game. And since then, everything looks good. 17, a top 10 finish, a top 10 finish, 15, a top 5 finish. I believe he finished top 3 at the position this past week due to 2 touchdowns. This guy is balling out, and he's balling out because not only is he playing well and Sean Payton adapted the offense to Bo Nix, Bo Nix is playing well too. Yes, this man right here, the guy who was like the 5th quarterback taken in the draft, people were like, he's not even a 1st round pick. He should be a 2nd round pick. And for the first 2 weeks to month of the season, it looked like that, but not lately. Because lately, this is how good Bo Nix has been the past 4 to 5 weeks. He currently ranks 4th in quarterback grades on PFF. That takes into account everything. Your ability not to turn the ball over, your ability to make big time throws, your ability to extend the play out of the pocket and throw, your just overall completion percentage, your decision making, all of that. He is legitimately not only a top 5 quarterback in fantasy the past 5 to 6 weeks, but also in real life right now. And I see the people rolling their eyes. Again, that is a split of 5 to 6 games. That's not saying moving forward the rest of the year and next year. He's just been playing lights out. And this is all going to carry over into a nice end of season schedule. You get a nice Monday Night Football game to showcase Bo Nix and Sutton. Then they go on their bye, and this is where it starts. The Colts, we talked about them. They're basically a bottom 10 secondary in every category. The Chargers is admittedly the toughest matchup you will see for him the rest of the season, Courtland Sutton, but this Chargers team has now allowed 100 yards per game the past 5 weeks on average to outside number 1 receivers, and Sutton faced them earlier this year. He found the end zone, he scored 15 points. And then in the fantasy championship, one of the 5 best matchups you can find against the Bengals, who have a bottom 5 secondary in terms of coverage grades, and they rank top 10 in not only receiving yards per game allowed, but also receiving touchdowns. It's a great spot. Now, before we get into the number 1 league winning wide receiver, who if this person is on your roster or somehow you have a trade deadline still, which I have in a couple of leagues, try and get them. Before we get there, I have an honorable mention. This will just be a quick one. It's the Packers wide receiver room. And I know what you're saying, Sal, we can't even decide whether we're playing Jaden Reed. We can't decide when we're playing Romeo Doubs when he's healthy. Heck, should we even roster Christian Watson half of these weeks? He looks great one week. He drops the ball the next week, right? I get it. But their schedule is that appealing that if you have a Jaden Reed on your team, or if you're in a deeper league where you're forced to start these Watson, Romeo Doubs, Ontavian Wicks, here's some good news. This is a top 5 schedule for the fantasy postseason for these Packers wide receivers. It starts with the Seahawks. Although Marvin Harrison couldn't get to them, we just did see them allow 7.7 yards per attempt to Kyler Murray. We saw Trey McBride have the big day. They are admittedly the toughest matchup the Packers wide receivers will face in the fantasy postseason, but it's at best an average defense if we're talking secondary. Then it goes to the Saints. This is where it gets really good. They, as of right now, play on Monday Night Football in Week 16. The Saints allow the 5th most receiving yards per game, bottom 10 secondary. And then the Vikings, which could be a game potentially for the division at that point. Who knows with the Lions? Definitely for some playoff seeding at that point. That is going to be all the guys out there for Green Bay, which in Week 17 is just sketchy in general. And the Vikings allow the 4th most passing yards per game. They have a bottom 5 pass rush this year. And the last time Jordan Love faced them, although the game script called for it, he threw for nearly 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. So that's an honorable mention for you. But the number 1 league-winning wide receiver, who has some bad publicity going on with him right now, is the Giants rookie wide receiver Malik Nabers. Look, he came out and he was basically saying, like, he was not implying that he was saying it wasn't the quarterback, but implying that it was the quarterback. He was saying that his coach didn't get him the ball basically until they were down by 30 points, so he couldn't do anything. All this stuff is getting him bad publicity, but let's keep it straight. For the fantasy postseason and rest of the season in general, Malik Nabers is about to explode. And that potentially starts this week on Thanksgiving. Maybe you're watching it after the game. Hopefully, because he's going to be facing a Cowboys team that ranks 30th in coverage grades this season. A Cowboys team that, just a week ago, 3 different Washington Commanders pass catchers had at least 13 fantasy points against them. 3 different guys. And Terry McLaurin was the guy who took the cake with over 100 yards and a touchdown. And I get it that Malik Nabers has been, everyone will say bad the past month of the season. He hasn't been as good as he was the first 4 weeks. I agree with you, but he's still been solid. Over the past month, he's still averaging 10.8 targets per game, 61 yards per game. And really the only reason why he's not producing top 5 numbers and he's only producing top 15 wide receiver numbers is because he hasn't scored a touchdown in the past month. But that could change moving forward in good matchups. And I get everybody wants to say Tommy DeVito stinks, and sure, but he has just no time to throw in that last game. Andrew Thomas going down might have been a bigger injury for this team or change than losing Daniel Jones. But what we're still getting on the season is strong usage from Malik Nabers. Neighbors, not only in overall targets, where he ranks number 1 in target share, so there's no competition on this team for him. He ranks 3rd in overall targets on the season with basically 12 per game, but he's getting a lot of deep looks. The only flaw in his game is red zone targets, because they're not getting there all that often, but that's why this nice schedule they're about to show you should help with that. Just 6 red zone targets is 42nd in the NFL. But like I said, there is legitimately no competition. When he's earning 36% of his team's targets, number 1 in the league, that means something. It means there's no competition and you're great. And both those things are true for the Giants. Wan'Dale Robinson is not legit target competition. He's basically getting the targets within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. He's basically a wide receiver. Though a running back at that point, getting checkdowns. These other guys, Jalen Hyatt can't get on the field. Darius Slayton is a talented number 3 receiver, but nothing to steal a lot of targets. When Theo Johnson, the tight end out of Penn State, which I like Theo Johnson, extreme athlete, when he's seeing 6 targets per game over the past month, number 2 on this team behind Malik Neighbors, when your number 1 competition is a rookie tight end who's not Brock Bowers, who's definitely tiers below Brock Bowers, yeah, you're going to be fine to see 10 plus targets per game. And when you see 10 plus targets per game with this remaining schedule, arguably the best, I would say it's the best remaining schedule out there. The Cowboys this week, we mentioned how bad they are. The Saints, we've already talked about them a couple of times in this video. That's a bad team. The Ravens, if it's not the Jaguars, it's the Ravens, who are the worst secondary against wide receivers and allow the most fantasy points per game. The Falcons, we've talked about the benefits of facing the Falcons. They have no pass rush. They allow overall on the season the 7th most receiving yards per game. And then the Colts, we've said, are basically bottom 10 in every metric possible for guarding wide receivers and just secondary play. This is a good schedule. Every team is in the bottom 10 and close to the bottom 5 in coverage grades and fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. I don't care if it's me, Sally Slaps, out there at quarterback instead of Tommy DeVito, right? Tommy Cullets. I don't care if it's me out there. Malik Neighbors is going to be a league winner down the stretch. So these have been the 5 wide receivers and an honorable mention that I believe are league winners. Must have league winners on your team. If you have them on your team, great. If you could still get them at the trade deadline, even better. Now, if you want to see the running back version of this video, we talked about 5 running backs and as well as an honorable mention. You can check it out. It released earlier in the week right here. And before you go, be sure to hit the subscribe button. Enjoy your Thanksgivings, everybody. Enjoy the holiday weekend. I'll see you on the next one.